Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. The reference to Ambassador Inderfurth by an earlier speaker reminded me of a discussion, Mr. Chairman, many years ago, on 28 January 2009 to be precise, where you and I were hosted to a lunch, which one of our colleagues, for which he was the host. The discussion turned to US policy on Afghanistan, and I recall you asking the visiting dignitary, who does your thinking on Afghanistan? The response I do not recall, because if it had been significant or important, I would have recalled it. But Mr. Chairman, one might be tempted to pose that query in the context of US foreign policy in general, and certainly in relation to US-India bilateral relations in particular. The fact that our bilateral relationship with the United States is important is a given. The US is the world's largest economy. At around US $15 trillion, it is twice the size that of China. The fact that it is a democracy makes it all the more special. Apart from a shared value system anchored in democracy, we now have what has been described as a strategic partnership, a concept or a process whose contours I never fully comprehended during the 39 years that I was a practicing diplomat. We have so many strategic partnerships, some clearly of dubious value and very little standing. Our strategic partnership with the United States should, however, be a defining feature of our foreign policy. But is it? There is no shortage of lofty pronouncements, Mr. Chairman. President Obama in 2010 said that the relationship was one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. He reiterated in November 2012 that India is a big part of my plans. And our Prime Minister, not to be left out of this warm exchanges, looked President Bush in the eye and said, the people of India deeply love you. And please recall that statement came at a time when there weren't too many other takers for the kind of policies President Bush was offering. The combined trade in goods and services for the year 2013 and 14 should cross US $100 billion. In the last 9 years, we have purchased defense equipment and platforms from the United States valued at nearly US $10 billion. Mr. Chairman, a sovereign does not tax another sovereign. And yet we got relief not because of the philosophical convergence of views, but because we put reciprocal measures on the table. A sovereign also is required to respect and uphold the dignity of the representative of another sovereign. A sovereign does not strip search the representative of the other sovereign. I suspect we will get a level playing field only after we insist on full reciprocity. And I must say to perhaps my most favorite boss during the service, Ambassador Man Singh, this was not a wage dispute between an employer and an employee. This was a case brought by the US government against a serving Indian diplomat. And the case was entirely on trumped-up charges of trafficking, which were later not pursued. Had it been a wage dispute, the difference was only whether she had worked 42 hours or 46 hours, we could have resolved it. But this other sovereign decided to cross what I think are the red lines. Courtesies, privileges, and issues of immunity will need to be addressed, I believe, in a focused manner. I now propose to briefly take up what the United States has been doing to us in two other areas of importance in our multilateral interaction. Those were my instructions from Ambassador Surendra Kumar.
Not in second request.
Since 2012, the US started mounting pressure on a range of Indian policies, claiming that India was protecting its industries through various measures intended to localize manufacture of electronic goods, telecom products, steel, drugs, and pharmaceuticals and other such products in India. In particular, the US has been claiming that India does not protect intellectual property rights for pharmaceutical products. Now, at issue are two compulsory licenses granted, and I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip through the details of my argument and come to the fact that at least 8 other West European countries have similar provisions for grant of compulsory licenses in the public interest. So do many Asian and Latin American countries. The Indian law is therefore neither unusual nor should be a cause of concern. So far, only 2 applications for compulsory license have been made since 2005. The US is a signatory to the TRIPS agreement and the Doha Declaration. If the US pharmaceutical industry is not satisfied with the standards adopted by India, they should go to their government, and the government should take us to the international dispute settlement mechanisms in the WTO. Clearly, India is TRIPS compliant. The effort appears to be to seek TRIPS Plus from us. There are some others like the Boeing Company and the US-India Business Council, representing wide and varied segments of the US business and industry. I would like to state here for the record what they say about our intellectual property systems. And I quote, Indian IPR laws applicable to the range of Boeing's business activities in India are comparable to IPR regulations in other developed countries, as India is a signatory to all major conventions and treaties on the subject. Additionally, in our experience, there have not been any major patent violations in India pertaining to Boeing's defense aerospace products. Boeing sells its products to the Government of India and private airlines where our IPR is contractually protected. We see minimal risk of product IPR violations by the Government of India and private airlines. I will skip the rest of my very detailed testimony which Boeing gave to the US ITC only a couple of weeks ago. Apart from this glowing tribute, the following is instructive. Market audit by AWACS shows that the sales of the 5 US pharmaceutical companies grew by 79% in a 4-year period between 2009 and 13. They are Abbott Healthcare 57%, Abbott India 104%, Pfizer 105%, Merck 74%, and BMS 59%. At the very least, Mr. Chairman, they're making a lot of money in India. Data for 7 foreign companies shows rise in imports of finished products by 425% in a 7-year period. Therefore, it is obvious that the business environment in India has not hindered growth of their sales or profits or repatriation of income. Also, the local content requirements which they are complaining about, I would like to draw your attention, Mr. Chairman, to the Buy America Act, which is extensively used by the United States in the development of the infrastructure, among others. The Federal Highway Administration's Buy America policies require a domestic manufacturing process. So I do not think the United States is in any position to talk to us about domestic content. I would now like to move from the arena of multilateral economic and commercial relations to the hardcore world of the UN Security Council and briefly touch on issues relating to the use of force and the right to intervene. Let me first mention India's aspirations to become a permanent member of the Security Council. Ambassador Man Singh referred to what President Obama said, and I quote, he said this in Delhi in November 2010, the just and sustainable international order that America seeks includes a United Nations that is efficient, effective, credible, and legitimate. That is why I can say today, in the years ahead, I look forward to a reformed UN Security Council that includes India as a permanent member. The bureaucracy thereafter left no stone unturned to pour cold water on this. The US delegation in New York made common cause with the Russians and the Chinese, who were the most opposed to India's aspiration to become a permanent member. These are the hard facts, Mr. Chairman. Let me now turn to the use of force and the right to intervene, as India has experienced it, including in our neighborhood. First, the case of Bangladesh. I would recommend to anyone who has an interest in the subject to read The Blood Telegram by Gary Bass, a distinguished American academic. Archer Kent Blood was the US Consul General in Dhaka in 1971. He and his colleagues were eyewitnesses to the genocide that Pakistani army was unleashing on the poor people of the erstwhile East Pakistan. Members of his staff documented individual cases of targeting and killing of people, those who were opposed to the regime and the Hindus. Washington's attention was, however, affixed elsewhere. When our then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi drew the attention of London and Washington to the genocide and the millions of refugees that India was receiving from East Pakistan, that did not resonate. When Archer Blood and 20 of his colleagues in the consulate wrote the famous Blood Telegram, Kissinger and Nixon chose to ignore it. The bloodshed and massacre that followed have been documented. The United States chose to ignore the human tragedy because Pakistan, the perpetrator, facilitated contact between the United States and China for Nixon's visit. In Rwanda again, and this is April 1994, the massacres were going to take place on a large scale was very well known. For some reason, the Clinton administration chose not to take notice. 800,000 people were mercilessly butchered. Contrast that to what happened, Mr. Chairman, in Libya. Saudi Arabia and Qatar armed the opposition. Over-enthusiasm for the Arab Spring led to the expectation that its outcome would resonate on a Western liberal democratic template. A Security Council resolution and military action by NATO was made the basis for regime change. Even the Security Council resolution was not completely followed. We voted, we abstained on it, and Russia and China did likewise. Because Russia and China were left in a confused state because we were not sure that the balance in the resolution would be followed, and it wasn't. The provisions for a ceasefire, the provisions for discussions were not. They decided to carry the military operation out till the end. The mistakes made in Libya have impacted on the deteriorating situation in Syria, where the United States has sought to blame the Russians and the Chinese. Fast forward that, Mr. Chairman, to Ukraine and Russian action in Crimea. A role reversal? Can we invoke the same doctrine? It would be useful to engage the United States and other interlocutors on the doctrine of the use of force and the right of intervention. What kind of sovereignty do we and the United States, or for that matter the rest of the world, believe in? If we believe in absolute sovereignty, then it stands to reason that every dictator with genocidal intent can do as he or she pleases within their own territorial limits. Surely that cannot be the case. We must be consistent. One cannot turn a blind eye to genocide in what is now Bangladesh and Rwanda, but sanction the use of force in Libya, where the action was based only on an imminence of threat. As democracies, we cannot but subscribe to the doctrine of responsible sovereignty, but responsible sovereignty is different from responsibility to protect. India, Mr. Chairman, as I understand Indian foreign policy, has never had any differences or any problems with the first two pillars of the responsibility to protect. The first pillar states that it is the duty of every government to prevent its population from being subjected to the four mass atrocities of genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. We also subscribe to the second pillar, which is that in the case of a state which has weak or failing institutions, a state which is on the verge of failure, it is the duty of the international community to step in and help bolster the institutions of the state. Our problem, Mr. Chairman, arises with Pillar 3, and as the red rose arrives, I can say, when and why should the international community intervene? These are the discussions we need to have. But let us be consistent. The least that we can do is not to lecture each other on high principle. I thank you very much.